Okay, let's begin this. So it is reproduction and vertebrates. Of course, I will also include the human part of human reproduction as well. So nonetheless, you are all welcomed by my dear friend Dicolo. Really cool name. Welcomed by Dicolo. So it's human reproduction, but we'll first start off with the types of fertilization. We've got internal fertilization, which happens inside of the body of whoever is supposed to carry that. This is basically the ones which takes place in human beings. It's internal fertilization, where we have the ovum within the body of the specimen and it is fertilized within the body. And then we've got external fertilization. This is the one that happens outside of the body of the specimen. So in other words, a good example you can get is chickens, which lay eggs, and then the rooster will come and sit on the eggs and do some cool stuff on top of those eggs. And then we've got these two terms, not as important, but they may be worth revising. So that is sexual and asexual reproduction. When we look at sexual reproductions, we can think of human beings. Let me change this. We can think of us, humans, sexual reproductions. This is reproduction that requires two parties. And then we've got asexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction, a good example you can get is bacteria. When we have fertilization amongst bacteria, we do not necessarily require two different genders of bacteria in order for us to have a fertilization taking place. So they can sort of have their own fertilization, sort of like self-fertilization. You can also call it self-service for those who are feeling nasty. So those are the background of the fertilization that we may need. Now there are reproductive methods that we need to know. So we've got ovipary, vipary, and ovovivipary. You can also call this vivipary as well. When we're looking at ovipary, let's look at the first letter, just so we can be able to remember what ovipary really means. The O can stand for outside, just stands for outside. So all we know is that everything happens outside. So to begin with, the fertilization will take place outside of the organism's body, and also the development of the embryo. The embryo is the offspring that is developing, the child, is also going to be taking place outside. So like chickens, fertilization takes place outside, as well as the development also takes place outside, up to the point where the whole conceiving takes place and so on. And then we've got vivipary. When we look at that V, just think of the vagina, right? We'll think of the vagina. So fertilization takes place inside it, and then the development of the embryo also takes place inside. Now the embryo will be fed through what is called the placenta. Now the placenta, when we hear about the placenta, we should start thinking about the umbilical stuff, the umbilical veins and the umbilical arteries and so on and so forth. And then ovovivipary, which contains the O as well as the V, is practically both. So fertilization can take place inside, right? So basically the egg will be retained inside of the organism, and then it will be laid after fertilization for the whole development of the embryo. So it will then take place outside. So that would be the development of the embryo, and then of course after that the organism will then develop from there onwards. A good example of this one would be seahorses, right? Would be seahorses. That's one example I can think of. I've run out of examples, but there's a lot of them out there. Now we have this called the amniotic egg. This is the basic structure of an egg. A good example you can get is a chicken's egg. In the amniotic egg, we have what are called extraembryonic membranes. So what we're saying is that an amniotic egg has multiple membranes, basically. So I've got the chorion, the allantois, and the amnion. Right. So these are the membranes that we have. Now, of course, we can have the outer shell acting as a membrane as well. Now, words such as the albumen and the amniotic cavity we do not really need, but this word though stands out, the amniotic fluid. That one does stand out. We do need to know the amniotic fluid, as well as our yolk sac. We also need to know that. So let's go through them. So we've got the chorion, the yolk sac, allantois, amnion, and the shell, and of course the amniotic fluid. So to begin with, let's start off from the outside of the egg, the shell. Now the shell is the one that is on the outer part. If this is the part that we usually break when we cooking up an egg or something. Now this shell, what it does is prevent the entire egg itself, all the fluids, from evaporating out into the atmosphere. So it prevents all these fluids from evaporating. And then as we go inside, we are going to find that albumin, which we do not necessarily require. Okay. And then we've got the much more required membranes now, the chorion. Alright, now the chorion, note, the chorion and the amnion are both for gaseous exchange. Oops. They are both for gaseous they are both for gaseous exchange. Both of them are for gaseous exchange. But what particularly stands out is that the chorion is only for gaseous exchange, but the amnion is also for excretion. Excretory waste and so on and so forth. Alright. Same goes for our allantois. It can also hold as for excretion. We'll of course see this in clear detail when we look at the human gestation period, and we'll look at what happens with the umbilical veins and umbilical arteries. Now what we have there is of course our embryo. Alright, so what you need to know is that these membranes that we have here are called extraembryonic membranes. Alright, and then extraembryonic membranes just means that we've got extra membranes for the embryo. That's basically what it means in layman's terms. Now we can go to the human beings. Now looking at the human beings, a background: males have one sex hormone, that is testosterone. That's pretty basic. We've known this for quite a while. This testosterone, it's secreted from the testicles. Those who don't know what testicles are, is the balls. Yes, it's the balls. And then females have got 4 hormones that we're going to look at in particular. The LH, which stands for the luteinizing hormone. Then we've got FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. And then we've got estrogen, or oestrogen if you're from a government school. And then we've got progesterone. So those are the 4 hormones that that are used in particular, usually in the menstrual cycle, as well as oogenesis as well. Alright, and then another thing to note is that male sex cells are sperm cells, of course. They are ejaculated in a substance called semen. Now this semen is made up of 3 elements. It is made up of we've got mucus, then we've got our actual sperm cells, and then we've got food, somewhat food. Actually, there's another element here called the alkaline fluid. Now all these elements, they are found inside of this semen that we're talking about. Now we will see this in detail while we while we look at the male reproductive structure. Female sex cells, rather, let's avoid calling them sex cells, we'll call them gametes. So the female gametes are called ovums, and women will generally produce 4 during oogenesis, but only 1 is going to be released. And the part where it is released, we remember this as ovulation, when the ovum is released. Alright, now we'll also see that in detail when we look at the menstrual cycle. So now, men first. Now, in the male reproductive system, we've got a couple of parts that we need to know. Now, there are others, of course, that you don't have to know, like this rectum. You don't really need to know that one. But anyways, we'll walk through it. We'll just look at the journey of the sperm cell itself. So let's start off with the testes. This is where our sperm cells are manufactured. Now, when they are manufactured inside the testes, they are not fully matured. Alright, so we'll call these, when they are in here, they are just spermatids. Alright, they are not complete sperm cells as of yet. The reason is because they are lacking a certain element called spermatozoa. So that is spermatozoa. Wow, spermatozoa. I'm hoping that is it's a Z there. Spermatozoa. So they'll be lacking this element. Now the part in which they're going to gain this element is within the epididymis, which is this part right there. Alright, so once they've been manufactured, they're going to be stored in the epididymis, where they're going to go through further processing and further maturity, and then this is where they're going to gain this element. So they'll then change from spermatids to matured sperm cells. Right. Then once they are in that epididymis, they're going to mature to sperm cells. And then suppose it is we have copulation going, right? During copulation, or rather sexual intercourse, what's going to happen is the person is going to experience arousal and all that. So this erectile tissue is going to be stimulated, right? And then the testosterone level is going to go high. Testo goes high, and then these matured sperm cells are going to be released into this part right here that sort of looks like a very long worm. So this part is the vas deferens. Right, now this vas deferens carries these sperm cells to that ejaculatory duct. Okay, so there is a certain surgical procedure that we need to know that can take place to this vas deferens. It's a contraceptive method. In other words, it's a method of contraception, a method that prevents pregnancy. So what can happen is that this vas deferens can be cut or tied up. Okay, so they call this a vasectomy, which is the cutting off the vas deferens. This is to prevent these sperm cells from reaching the ejaculatory duct. Now, a question that they love asking in the exam is, if a person has gone through vasectomy, will they still be able to give off the HIV virus? In other words, HIV. And the answer to that is yes, they can still give off the HIV virus. Reason being, during ejaculation, it's not only sperm cells that will be ejected, because remember, it is semen, and semen has multiple elements, so all those other fluids that will be secreted can also carry that HIV virus. It's not only the sperm cells. Okay, and we will look at those fluids as well that make up that semen, and where really they are going to be secreted from. Alright, so sperm cell goes up into that, and then it reaches what is known as the seminal vesicle. Okay, now this is one of the glands that secrete one of those elements inside semen. Okay, so we've got our seminal vesicle. Now this seminal vesicle is going to secrete our alkaline fluid. Now this alkaline fluid, what it does is that it's going to neutralize the vaginal acid. So if you look at the female reproductive structure, right at the vagina, there's a certain acid that is found there, and it can only be countered by that alkaline fluid that we're talking about. Okay, so what this vaginal acid does is that it will kill any sperm cell that passes through it. Now if, of course, this semen that is secreted is viable, it should carry the right amount of alkaline fluid to counter that vaginal acid in order to keep those sperm cells viable. Alright, so now once the sperm reaches there, it will mix up with that alkaline fluid, and then it will keep going. Now there's a certain structure that has been omitted here. It looks like a leaf of some sort, like that. Okay, it's another gland that we need to know, called the Cowper's gland. Okay, so that is the Cowper's gland. Now of course it has been omitted from this drawing. Now this Cowper's gland secretes mucus. Okay, it secretes mucus. Now this mucus, it's slippery, it helps with the motion of the sperm cells. Okay, it's slippery, so it acts as a lubricant of some sort. Okay, so it goes up, mixes with that mucus, and then it keeps going towards that ejaculatory duct where it will meet the other gland called the prostate gland. Okay, now this prostate gland is what's going to give us our food. Alright, that's what's going to give us that food that we require for the sperm cells in order to get the energy to go. Alright, so everything mixes up, and then once all this mixing in the ejaculatory duct takes place, which is right there, that's when we're going to have semen entirely. So now the semen will then go through this structure called the urethra. Okay, now this urethra is housed inside the penis, or if you're nasty, we'll just call that dick. Now of course it's not a biological term entirely, but I like this word anyways. So it is housed inside the penis. One function for the penis is that it is responsible for delivering the sperm cells right into the female reproductive structure. And note that during copulation, this penis has to be erected. Alright, it has to be erected, otherwise this erectile tissue cannot be stimulated during copulation, and also it will not really fit into that female reproductive structure. So the sperm cells will go through this urethra and then out the penis, and it has to be delivered right into the female reproductive system. So this is the male reproductive structure. Now you can see other certain elements that do not really have any use to this whole copulation situation, such as the urinary bladder. This just has to do with urine. So this is only to show that the urine is stored in that urinary bladder. It's also released into the very same urethra when the male is urinating and all that. Then we've got pubic bone, which has literally no job through this whole journey of reproduction. So the sperm ninja, yeah, that's him right there. Yeah, okay, the sperm cell, the reproductive ninja, looks somewhat like this. It is made up of three portions: the head, the middle section of the body, and the tail. Now looking at the head has a certain part called the acrosome, which is right there. Okay, now what it does is that it contains enzymes which will digest the outer membrane of the ovum. Now the ovum can look something like this. Alright, so what it does is that it will digest this part, that outer membrane. Okay, so we need that acrosome. So if a sperm cell is not completely viable, it may be lacking this acrosome. Okay, and then deeper into that acrosome towards, while we're still at the head, that's where we have the nucleus, which contains 23 chromosomes. Now remember, these 23 chromosomes are haploid, right? They are haploid, which means they are half of the amount in a somatic cell. Somatic cell containing 46 chromosomes. Somatic cell containing 46 chromosomes. Our haploid will then contain 23 chromosomes because it's a gamete. And the reason for this change from 46 to 23 is because of that meiosis that we spoke about earlier. So that meiosis actually halves this, okay, and this all happens inside the testicles during that process called spermatogenesis. Okay, now deeper into this, we go into the middle portion. This is the mitochondria. Now the mitochondria contains the energy. Now remember, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so this is where it gets the energy from. And then we've got the tail. This is just used for propulsion. Okay, we use this for propulsion. Okay, so this is what it uses to swim. Okay, now we can look at females. Things to note is that females go through a process known as the menstrual cycle. Now the menstrual cycle is made up of two parts. It's made up of two cycles. There's a cycle that takes place in the uterus, and there's another one that takes place in the ovaries. Now one that takes place in the ovaries is called the ovarian cycle, and then the one that takes place in the uterus is what we know as the uterine cycle, right? Okay, and then there's something called the fallopian tube, which we'll see. It is lined with what is called cilia. Cilia are sort of like hair cells. Now what these hair cells do is that they only brush in one direction. So this is so that the ovum during ovulation is only directed towards the uterus and not back to the ovaries. Okay, so during ovulation, remember, they're going to release an ovum. So this ovum has to be taken to the uterus. Okay, so these cilia will ensure that they do not go back to the ovaries. Okay, so they only brush in one direction. Okay, during menstruation, the endometrium peels off and it is released along with the unfertilized ovum. Now this is what we know as menstruation. Menstruation. So this is basically getting rid of every ovum that has not been fertilized. And yes, women are weird after all. They do go through this process once a month. And then looking over at males, males do ejaculate millions of sperm cells. At the same time, they do manufacture these millions of sperm cells each and every time. So with females, this goes on for once a month, which we will look at during our ovulation and all that. Okay, so they ejaculate millions of sperm cells into the female reproductive system, and then it will go through a process called fertilization. And remember, this fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube. Now sperm cells are produced in the testes, forgive the spelling, in the testes, in a meiotic process called spermatogenesis. Now the female version of spermatogenesis is called oogenesis, which we will also look at. When a male ejaculates, he releases what is known as semen, which contains the alkaline fluid, the mucus, and the actual sperm cells. Okay, now this we saw previously when we looked at the male reproductive system. We saw this came from the seminal vesicle, this came from the mucus came from the corpus gland, and these sperm cells came all the way from the testicles. Alright, Now, men undergo a contraceptive method known as the vasectomy, which prevents the release of sperm cells. Now, of course, remember the HIV virus can still be contracted because of these other fluids which are released. Then now looking at the female reproductive system, it looks like two flamingos facing one side and probably dancing or something. So starting off, we do have the vagina. Now along the vagina we have something called the vulva, which is that opening into the cervix, and then we've got that vagina. Remember, within that vagina, that's where we have that vaginal acid that kills sperm cells that are non-viable, that do not contain that alkaline fluid which we spoke of earlier. And then we've got the cervix, right? And then the cervix being the opening into the uterus. This is where we have our uterine cavity, or we'll just call it the uterus or something. This is what we call the birth canal. This is where the gestation takes place, okay? The period of pregnancy. This is where it all takes place, okay? Now inner into this, we've got the neck of the flamingo, which is our fallopian tube, okay? Now this fallopian tube, this is where our fertilization takes place. As you can note, that ovum is there. So the time in which this ovum is within the fallopian tube, it is during our ovulation. So during ovulation, this is where the female is most likely pregnant, where the pregnancy is most likely, okay? This is where she is most fertile, because this ovum will then be in the fallopian tube. Now remember, our cilia is lined there and showing that the ovum goes towards the uterus and it does not go back to the ovaries. Now that's our ovaries. This is where oogenesis takes place, okay? Another thing to note is, of course, our endometrium, which is this lining of blood within the uterus. Now this endometrium is what forms the placenta. It forms the placenta. Now this placenta is basically what ends up feeding the embryo during the gestation period, okay? Now that is the female reproductive system. We will look at it, of course, in detail during the gestation period, okay? And then after this, we shall look at our gametogenesis, which is the generation of gametes. We'll look at those two parts later on, okay? Now, peace.